Welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm Kathleen Walter. The sacrifice and dedication of the elite warriors of the U.S. military are now captured in a brand new book by Colonel Oliver North, who also hosts the documentary series War Stories on Fox News. Colonel North, a decorated Marine veteran who served 22 years, has written American Heroes in Special Operations. It is the companion to his New York Times bestseller, American Heroes in the Fight Against Radical Islam. He joins us now from Washington. Welcome back to Newsmax TV, Colonel North.
Great to be with you, Kathleen.
Congratulations on the book.
Thank you. It's done well.
While shooting war stories, you followed the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines of the U.S. Special Operations Command, brave men and women who are on the cutting edge of the war against radical Islam and terror. What did you see that compelled you to write this book?
Well, it took forever to get permission to do it. We've been embedded with all kinds of military units in this long war now for 9 years. And having seen a lot of these folks, they had asked me, hey, how come you never cover us? Well, of course, it requires special permission to be able to go out, embed with those units. And I had to agree up front, as I wrote in the book and as we tell people on air. We agreed not to tell the enemy things they didn't need to know about tactics, techniques, procedures, weapons, and equipment. And I also promised that I wouldn't divulge any names or places, particularly the faces of undercover guys that would be put at risk for that. Once we had all that in place, it became an opportunity to go out and cover them. I guess the only other requirement was I had to be able to keep up with them, which I will tell you is a challenge for anybody who's not as fit as these remarkable young Americans are. They're extraordinary fighters, warriors. And of course, they're doing some of the most dangerous and difficult assignments you can imagine because they're so far from other friendlies and most of their operations are classified. So it was a great opportunity in this book to be able to let them tell their stories, many of which would not have been told otherwise.
What impact does the latest WikiLeaks release have on the war on terror, and how do the disclosures affect our men and women in uniform on the battlefield?
You know, I was over there when the first of these occurred and covering some of these very units that were operational. And of course, some of the stuff that was in that initial batch of leaks had to do with those kinds of operations, so-called capture-kill missions. They regard this to be very, very dangerous for two reasons. Number one, divulging the names of Americans who are involved in it because in many cases they have families back here in the States that are not living on U.S. military bases. The second part is in the longer term of even greater risk in that it puts at risk those who work with us in foreign countries on these very kinds of operations. And of course, to the extent that they feel vulnerable, they're less inclined to do so. And obviously, if there's the name of a foreign national who's been helping conduct these kinds of undercover operations, these kinds of special missions, and that source or that informant or that assistant who's been helping these operations be conducted could easily get killed. I don't know specifically of any cases, names in other words, but certainly there's a great concern that others have been put at risk because of this.
British authorities have arrested WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange on sex crimes charges from Sweden. Now that he is out of hiding, do you think that the U.S. will go after him for the leaks, and what kind of punishment should he face?
Well, I'm concerned on one front here, and there appears to be some doubt at the Obama Department of Justice as to whether they can bring charges. There's no doubt in my mind, and I don't think there's any doubt in the minds of those who've seen the documents, that this has created enormous problems for the United States and that there's a crime been committed. I mean, this is an act of terrorism. I mean, it's information terrorism instead of a bomb going off in Times Square, but it's still terrorism. And if we don't have laws that will address this, we should. Second of all, the individuals who provided the information to him initially, now he's not, of course, he doesn't have real access to the computers from which all this information was downloaded. But apparently there's at least one, if not multiple members of various government organizations, in one case that's been widely reported, a PFC in the United States Army. If that's true, that individual needs to see the inside of a jail cell for the rest of his life, because jeopardizing American lives and the lives of others who've helped America in very difficult and dangerous circumstances has got to be a crime. And what this young person did was violate all of the non-disclosure agreements that they made. Look, I signed dozens of those non-disclosure agreements. I make promises in writing books like this that I won't disclose certain things that would put Americans at risk. If they insist on that from an author and from a person who covers the military for a beat, and that is my only beat for Fox News, then certainly someone who's in the military needs to pay. The ultimate price for this ought to be a lifetime in jail. Let them contemplate that from Leavenworth.
Colonel North, from your perspective, do you think that the Obama administration has been soft from the get-go on the WikiLeaks issue?
Well, you know, I recall the initial disclosure was, oh, there's really nothing bad here. And of course now they're saying, yeah, I guess there's bad things that have happened, but you also have people inside the administration saying, we can recover from all this. The reality of it is everything you do that makes it more difficult to carry out America's foreign policy, protect American citizens, protect our national security, is something that you didn't have to do because of either incompetence, misfeasance, or malfeasance, then this administration needs to be called to account for it. And they've done nothing thus far that I can find out that indicates that they have any real concern over this. There appears to be nobody in charge at the Department of Justice in bringing this case to some kind of justice. There's been no request by the U.S. government that I know of to have him extradited to the United States to stand trial. And obviously there's people in the Department of Justice whose job it is to protect national security secrets.
Another big story this week, General Petraeus' admission that he wasn't sure that victory could be achieved in Afghanistan by 2014. Should the U.S. have a timeline for withdrawal, and is victory possible?
Well, you know, I've interviewed General Petraeus, particularly on this last trip, for almost an hour. And one of the things that he says in the documentary that will air on Fox News here in a few weeks from this last trip is that you can't put a timeline on how quickly we can train Afghan national security forces to do the job that they need to do. There's no doubt that we've taken dramatic steps in the last 6 months to make that happen. General Petraeus, General Caldwell, who's in charge of the overall training, have made remarkable progress in getting the Afghans, one, to volunteer to serve their own country, and number two, to stay with it. They've implemented all kinds of programs to do everything from teach young Afghans how to read and write, which of course, because it's got an astronomical illiteracy rate in the country. Second of all, to get them competent at enforcing their own laws. In other words, our ticket out, our bus ticket out of Afghanistan for the United States military and military operations is an Afghan national security force. That means intelligence, police, and army, able to protect itself from its internal adversaries like the Taliban and from external threats like that from Pakistan or Iran. Once they're able to do that, there's no reason to keep U.S. forces there. The reality of it is it's going to take considerable length of time. I can't say that you couldn't do it or you could do it by 2014. But telling the enemy that we're going to pull out and be gone by date certain certainly gives incentive to our adversaries and disappoints our allies. And what the Obama administration did, starting in November last year, when he made that promise that we're going to pull out combat troops by, start the transition, or however he's putting it today. But he set a date certain of July 2011 for that, and now we've got the date certain of 2014. It makes the job that has to be done on the ground by remarkable men like General David Petraeus, General Caldwell, all those soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, much more difficult when the enemy thinks, A, they're going to quit no matter what, and B, here's a date certain. All we have to do is hang on for that.
To tensions in the Korean Peninsula and questions about the Iranian nuclear threat, should the U.S. be taking a harder line approach toward Iran and North Korea?
Well, this administration is the one that wanted to go out and chat with everybody. That offer was rebuffed. Efforts at embracing the Russians and trying to get them to do more about Iran obviously have been turned away, spurned. And what we've done about North Korea is absolutely nothing except talk, and now they're going to talk some more. The idea that the Chinese really want to be able to help America in this case, I think is, quite frankly, it's utopian. The Chinese have an interest in America spending as much of its wealth as possible on our military expenditures. The Russians have the same interest. There's nothing to be gained from their very narrow perspective of their self-interest in helping the United States in either case. And in both cases, Iran and North Korea, you have nuclear powers who are adamant that they are going to be able to use nuclear weapons against their enemies. If that isn't seen as a major threat to the United States by this administration, they are inhaling some of the product that apparently is being brought across the border from Mexico. Another case where they've done absolutely nothing.
To another national security issue, supporters of ratifying the START treaty this year hope Congress will act. Can you explain what's at stake with this treaty and whether you think it should be dealt with now or in the next session of Congress?
Well, first of all, this session of Congress, the lame duck session of Congress, has at most 2 more weeks in office. What is the rush to get a treaty that's going to be in effect for at least 10 years? What's the rush to get that treaty done, other than one more phony campaign promise being made by the Obama administration? I mean, somebody needs to sit back and I think several members of the Senate have done so, and say, if it's that important a treaty, and it certainly could be, if it's going to restrict our ability to build certain nuclear weapons and deploy certain ballistic missile defenses, then we need to take a very careful look at this. There's no great rush to get this done in 2 weeks, except from this administration.
Speaking of lame duck, White House officials say they're confident that the lame duck Congress will deal with don't ask, don't tell. What is your take on the idea of repeal?
The same thing with the START treaty. There's no great rush to deal with this problem. And what it's going to do is, if they rush to get this thing done, is you will have an immediate short-term effect on retention and a long-term effect on recruitment. We are in the midst of a war. There's 150,000 young Americans in harm's way, 50,000 of them in Iraq, 100,000 of them in Afghanistan. They should not be put under the additional stress of what this administration proposed as a campaign promise to do away with what they called the policy of don't ask, don't tell. What we're talking about is repealing Section 654 of Title 10 of the U.S. Code that finds homosexual activity is incompatible with military service. The law is very specific. They want to repeal that law. But guess what? The words don't ask, don't tell don't appear in the law. And the don't ask, don't tell policy will continue no matter what Mr. Obama says. And so the reality of it is, you now have a military force under enormous stress, with families back in the states dealing with all of the uncertainty that goes with a family member serving in combat. And now you're going to add that extra burden of telling a youngster, by the way, you don't have a conscientious objector status if you find homosexuality to be immoral. You try explaining that to the young recruit's family of a 17-year-old's God-fearing, church-going parents, that you also want him to serve in the military and live with a homosexual. I will tell you, it will have a terrible impact long-term on America's ability to defend itself.
Last question real quickly, Colonel North. 69 years ago, on December 7th, 1941, Japanese forces attacked at Pearl Harbor. As we remember that fateful date, what can the servicemen and women of today, the folks that you met while researching your book, learn from the resolve of the greatest generation?
Well, there's no doubt that America is better prepared to deal with and deter that kind of surprise attack than it's ever been before. We have the brightest, best educated, trained, led, and equipped military force the world's ever seen. Today, they're the most combat experienced in the world. We have things in place for everywhere from satellites to ground-based intelligence systems that ought to give us fair warning of an attack like that. At the same time, what happened on December 7th, 69 years ago today, was darn near replicated on 9/11/01, where 4 airplanes are seized, hijacked, with a handful of people, at far lower cost than the Japanese ever invested to bomb Pearl Harbor or to fight World War II. And we're now engaged in a war very much akin to what we fought in the Pacific, where our enemy in the Pacific was willing to launch suicidal banzai attacks and kamikaze planes with suicidal pilots in it. Our enemy today, radical Islamists, are wanting, just like the kamikazes, to die in the process of killing Americans. The lesson of Pearl Harbor ought never to be forgotten. And of course, the motto that came from that 69 years ago, and the war in which my dad fought was, remember Pearl Harbor, never again. We need to keep that to mind.
All right, the book is American Heroes in Special Operations. Colonel Oliver North, thank you so much for joining us. It's always great to have you here on Newsmax TV.
Thank you, Catherine. Appreciate you.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.